So we want to talk about Herod the Builder. And as I mentioned, Herod had many building projects, not just in Palestine, but all over the Eastern Mediterranean. Greece, Turkey, up the coast, what today would probably be Lebanon. And of course, the focus of what we're mainly interested in today are those things in Palestine. And his character comes out. One of the things that he builds are fortresses. Herod's personality, again, I'm not a psychologist or anything, but you might use the word paranoid. At least people have used the word paranoid. Was he clinically paranoid? I don't know. But he certainly was a guy who was concerned about his security. How's that? It's like I always say, just because I'm paranoid doesn't mean people aren't following me. Anyway, so Herod definitely believed that, and he was paranoid of, well, about everybody. So those closest to him, he was paranoid probably more than others. He actually had his own family, many of them executed. So he will build several fortresses that are primarily, you might call them a palace area, but they're really there as defensible points, places where he could go when he felt like maybe somebody was out to get him. Most famous of which is Masada, which you see pictured here. So, when you go with me next summer to Israel, undoubtedly we will go visit Masada. You'll get to see this one. It's shaped like it kind of looks like, it's a flat thing. Some people have just said it's kind of like like an aircraft carrier, battleship or something. I mean, it's very flat on the top and very precipitous on the sides. It's built near the Dead Sea. It was used eventually later, it was used by Herod, but then after Herod, it was used during the first Jewish revolt, and the Romans had to lay siege to it. He also had similar, although not as famous, perhaps, Machaerus, which is across the Dead Sea area and is today in the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan, which also has a similar plan, although not quite as big, not quite as precipitous as this one. And then, of course, Herodian. Herodian is another, and there were more. He has probably about 6. He has some in the north. He has them in various places. He has about 6 or 7 of them. Herodian is the place where he was buried. It was long speculated he buried there, but they actually found his tomb, what people believe is his tomb, which is down at the base of that, which is also, that one kind of looks like a volcano. They took a hill and he built on top of it, and then there, I think I've got some pictures later. Now, of course, he has other major building campaigns in Jerusalem, which we have talked about. Primarily, we talk about the temple, the building of the temple and the temple platform, but he also built a palace there. He built several things there, most famous of which was the temple. He rebuilds the temple, and he had to keep the temple. One of the challenges was keeping the temple functioning while he was rebuilding it. That presented a challenge, but with a lot of money and a lot of determination, he did it. Also, he built, yeah, go ahead.
Didn't he have to train a bunch of priests to become like carpenters and stuff because
he did.
the priests could interact with them?
Yeah, he had to also, yes, the Jewish laws also came into play because to enter certain, to keep the temple going, you could then only use priests who could enter certain areas. Yeah, so they had to be trained to be stonemasons. Or it's hard to make a stonemason into a priest, but you could potentially make a priest into a stonemason.
Like Armageddon, where they make a bunch of oil diggers into astronauts instead of making astronauts into oil diggers.
I would rather not comment about any of that. I'm not familiar with the astronaut and oil diggers perspective of the future times. Anyway, let's talk about another, probably maybe his most famous, maybe second only to the temple. I mean, it's hard to say. It depends, I guess, what you're interested in. but certainly had a major impact on Roman history, and that was the building of Caesarea Maritima, as you see pictured here. This is from a cover of a book, which has, that's actually a gem, like a ring, a signet ring that has the boat and part of the harbor there. Herod constructs this over a period of about 12 years or so, depending on how you mark it as beginning and mark it as being end. But there was already a site there was already some things there, but he transforms it into a major harbor. Part of the problem here is, or part of the challenge, I guess I should say, is that Israel has no good harbors, really. If you take a look at Israel, all their coastline is very smooth. I don't know if you've ever noticed, but most good harbors are not along smooth coasts. That's a very simple oversimplification, but it's true. You want a bay, you want an inlet. Why? To save you from storms, give you some protection. If you have a bay or an inlet, the ship can come into that inlet and sort of get out of the storm somewhat, some of the wind. Had nothing like that. Everything's very smooth. The waters really are made, the coastline's made smooth because of the flow of the water and of the silting, the sands of the Nile. I mean, that's a big part of it. Nile is a major river, longest river in the world, and a lot of stuff flows out of it, and it flows right up and sort of lands along the coast of Israel, and it has for millennia. Therefore, the coast is very smooth. Okay, till you get north of Mount Carmel. And then, of course, there are other modern harbor in the south. Eilat is protected somewhat in the south. But on the Mediterranean, had no good harbors. So this is called Stratos Tower originally. It was on the coast of the Sharon Plain, or the Plain of Sharon. And it becomes, of course, the New Testament era, the Roman era, main port of Palestine and the seat of the government. It was a challenge, but I think Herod, showing off, he wanted to make a point, he wanted to get attention. Part of that attention getting was building a harbor that is where basically you can't build it. So he does. And he has to use a lot of techniques. And in fact, it gets a lot of attention all around the Roman Empire. And of course, he kind of liked that. Where is it located? Here it is. You can see the arrows pointing. Notice that the coastline is very smooth. Do you see that? Pretty much all the way up. Mount Carmel's got a hump there that comes out. But other than that, it's pretty smooth all the way up. This is why, in, say, the times of Solomon, the harbors were clear up at Tyre. You see way up at the top of the map, Tyre. The Phoenicians had some good harbors, and they were great shipbuilders. And so somebody like Solomon will use them as his navy. And anyway, Herod wants to correct that. So here is a map that shows you the harbor itself. You can see a lot of things on this map if you look carefully. Of course, this has the ruins as they appear today, so it's not just Roman material that's here. But notice where the harbor is in this area, the harbor. And notice the hippodrome off to the lower sort of right. You can see the hippodrome. That was definitely Roman. And then to the north, way up to the north, you can see the aqueducts, high aqueduct, low aqueduct. You can also find lots of other Roman remains now. There's an amphitheater and so forth. This is now a national park, has been an Israeli national park for many years now. So to get into this park, you've got to buy a ticket, And then they have other things there, you know, they have restaurants and things like that. School groups come here and so forth. But it's been the seat of excavations for a long, long time. Some of the things that they find, for example, this lamp was found at Caesarea. A typical Roman-style mold-made lamp. So you can see the different parts of the lamp and how it's used. You know, people over the centuries have had to have light, and this is the way they did it. It changes. You know, this is the way it is with pottery. Pottery, normally in ancient times, has a function. In other words, it's not just as today, sometimes we have pottery that people never intend to use, right? They're just going to take it and set it on a shelf or something and say, oh, that's a nice piece of art. That's, you know, I won't say that never happened in the ancient world, but primarily most of the pottery is functional. And the function stays the same. We need to light this place up, but the form changes with time. And so that's what we see here. So we see the wick hole, that's A, and then the place where they put the oil in, that is D. The rest of it, of course, as you study the pottery, you begin to be able to recognize what period it's from. So pottery actually becomes our indicator, our chronological indicator, especially in the Middle East, but really all over the world. We find pottery out here in Florida where we're digging, and that pottery helps indicate what we are, what period we are digging in. And so we see here is now a map of the harbor itself. It has some Crusader fortifications, although Crusader is spelled incorrectly on this chart, this map. But you can see this part that sticks out into the water, and that's the part that had to be built. It's all man-made. It's all artificial. How could that be done? It was done with a cement that actually hardens underwater. So they would take big forms, wooden frames, they would pour the concrete into it, they would then let it sink to the ground, sink underwater, down to the surface, the ground under the water, and then they just built from there. And so here we see a picture of it. This is part of the harbor area, the way it looks today. This is actually Herod's palace that is overlooking the water. A lot of the palace has been ruined, but you can still see some of the mosaic floors. You still see the outline of the walls. You can still see much that's there, or was there. So he also built a lavish palace for himself. A lot of the water level is now a bit higher, so he actually had a swimming pool. Well, I thought it was interesting. He had a swimming pool right next to the ocean. Of course, you know, wealthy people still do that today, right? We can go swimming anytime. You can kind of control it. Don't have to worry about things like jellyfish and sharks and intrusive manatees who assault people like me. You got to watch the manatees. Anyway, Caesarea is mentioned 17 times in the New Testament. So it's not a unknown site. And by the way, some of you are asking, oh, you know, how do we do these presentations? How do we do these papers? I'm trying to sort of model it for you here, right? You give the background of the site, you give the location of the site, you give the biblical connection to the site if it has any, or other texts that we have. And then we talk about some of the things that have been found there. That kind of thing. That's really what I'm looking for. But I think you'll do fine. At any rate, you can see Philip was here, Saul was here, Acts 8, Acts 9. Cornelius is converted, he lives here. He's a centurion, of course. Peter shows up for that, Acts 10, Acts 11. Herod Agrippa I died here, Acts 12. We know that date, AD 44. So in other words, it's a prominent site. It's a very important site. It's the capital, really, the Roman capital, and the seat of the government. It's also the focal point of all the commerce of Palestine. So it makes it a very strategic location. Now here is an interesting picture that I wanted you to see. This is what's the remains of the aqueduct. And you see it goes on quite a ways. A couple summers ago, with some of the students, when we went on a dig, we actually stayed up to the north there. There's a village, a town, small town, and then we walked to Caesarea that way, and we walked all along the beach here and all along this. So there's a lot of places along here you can see it. Some of it's in better preservation than others. This is a place where it's really in pretty good preservation. This was built and rebuilt. Okay, so it was built there in really 1st century BC, expanded in the 2nd century AD, and then refurbished, you know. And this was to move water. This was a key to any Roman city. As we've been studying, you remember we had the video about the Roman city and how it's put together. A key to life anywhere is water. If you don't have water, you're not going to last very long. And we see that the Romans took that very seriously. So maybe one of their greatest achievements, it's hard to, I suppose, list, but engineering achievements, that was their water system was pretty amazing. And that's why they could build cities where they did. So we see that Caesarea is also mentioned as the Apostle Paul travels through here. At the end of his 2nd missionary journey and his 3rd. You read about that in Acts 18 and Acts 21. Paul is a prisoner in Caesarea for several years. Remember, he is arrested in Jerusalem. He's charged, several Jews charged him with causing trouble. The Romans came and arrested him, took him into the fortress Antonia, and then transported him out to the capital for trial. He was before 2 different judges, and then the 2nd judge, he appealed to Rome, the 1st judge, and then that judge was replaced by a 2nd judge who decided, you know what, if that's where you want to go, fine. So he shipped him out. He wanted to sort of clear his calendar. So he appealed then to Rome, and that's when he takes off on his famous sailing that leads to a shipwreck and lots of other things that are mentioned in the book of Acts. So there's the aqueduct area. Caesarea also has a fine theater. Now this has been partially reconstructed, as you see here. It's still used for concerts and other events. As you can see, it's set up here for musical events and that sort of thing. As you sit in the seats, you look towards the sea. You look towards the Mediterranean. So it's, beautiful view. Also, the prevalent winds come from the Mediterranean. So as far as sound goes, the wind sort of blows the sound towards you. That also helps. And Roman theaters were constructed in such a way as to help magnify the sound, because they had no, of course, amplification as far as, like we use, electronic. So they used these mechanical features of the theater, as well as sometimes they would actually build in to the theater itself some round insets, which actually would reverberate the sound as well. Some of the plays and that sort of thing, sometimes the mask would have a little megaphone built into it to magnify the sound to some degree. The population of the city, of course, has to come from estimates, various estimates from the size of, like the seating capacity of the theater and other things like that. Herodian period is thought to be about 40,000. Byzantine period, this is really the biggest population, was about 100,000. And by the time you get to the Crusader period, it's back down to about 12,000. So there are many, many things that are there that could be highlighted in Caesarea. There's the theater, there are palaces, there's an amphitheater, there's a hippodrome, there's a synagogue, 3 aqueducts, bathhouses, temples, 3 different sections to the harbor. So all of these things have been, well, most of these things have been explored and even excavated. And of course, part of the challenges of the harbor is that it's all submerged. So much of this had to be done using underwater archaeology techniques, guys with tanks and masks and so forth. They go down with a giant vacuum hose, really, to use, and they vacuum up the sand and debris on the bottom. It gets pumped up to the boat up above. It then gets placed through screens there, where they separate out any artifacts. So it presents several challenges to map it, to record it, and so forth. Okay? So, there we have it. During the Byzantine period, of course, this is the later period after the Western Roman part falls, the Eastern Roman part remains. It's typically called the Byzantine period, and this is, it was famous for being a home of Christian scholars and a library. For example, those of you who are in the early church class know we've been reading Eusebius. Eusebius's home is Caesarea. I don't know if you realize that, but Eusebius was the bishop of Caesarea. But other scholars were there as well. It continues to be excavated by various teams. It changes over time. Some projects end, others start. But this has been pretty much continuously excavated since the 1950s, for probably the last 60 years or so, at least. And it does present its challenges, as you can see maybe in this picture, if you look carefully in the lower right. As they're excavating, their square is starting to fill up with water. So they have to actually use pumps to pump the water out of the square. This is not anything I've ever experienced. Maybe I will this summer because I'm going to England and I'm going to dig up near Hadrian's Wall, which is very boggy. I don't know if they actually pump any of the water out there. I guess I'll find out. But it is very wet because they told me I need to bring my wellies. And if you know what wellies are, those are basically rubber boots, British style. That's what they call them, Wellington boots. So they call them wellies. So we'll find out. So here is maybe a little better. I just got a few pictures of the site itself now to illustrate. Here is the aqueduct. And you can see a couple of people down there. I mean, if you look very carefully, I think you can see maybe a person or two down here because it's quite large. You can sort of get up and walk on it, although there are parts that are broken out. The Romans would build these, of course, as I think you know by now, all based on gravity. So the water had to come from, in this case, coming from the north, probably come up from around Mount Carmel, perhaps further, and but mostly Mount Carmel, and to get the run from the springs and from the rivers, and they would actually gravity feed it. So there's no pumps here. It would all be gravity fed to the city itself. Once it arrives in the city, they would be dispersed throughout the city, and still by gravity then would go into drains, sewers, and then eventually out to sea, right? As a flushing process. So this is quite an achievement. Now, there were times when the Romans couldn't get the gravity thing to work. They did have a system of siphons. They didn't like to use them, but they would use them if they had to, where it basically kind of like the water flowing over the top of it would create a suction and actually sort of create, not a pump, but a siphon. They did have a siphon system on some occasions when they could not overcome some of the other problems. Here is an aerial view of the harbor as it appears, well, fairly recently. You can see the greenness, the green areas here. So this is the part you see today that you might think is the harbor, but the harbor is much bigger. And then right in this area was actually the entrance to the harbor. in the Roman times. So the Romans had to build it by sending boats out, having frames, filling it with this concrete that would harden underwater, filling up the frame, let the frame sink into place, and then placing more beside it and on top of it until they created a breakwater and the actual harbor. Then they built on top of it. Here is a artist's rendering of what that harbor looked like in the Roman period when it was completed. So you can see the entrance to the harbor was here, and you can see a tower on either side. Again, for protection, but also ceremony, right? Impress you. And then, of course, a very large lighthouse that was built to let ships know this is where the harbor is here at night or in times of storms. And then that harbor had on top of it, it had built several storehouses. So as the boats would come in, the ships would come in, they'd be unloaded here and placed in the warehouses, storehouses, and then from there moved on to land. You can also see in the background here a temple to Augustus. This was all dedicated to Caesar Augustus, hence the name Caesarea for Caesar. So I guess honoring both Julius Caesar, but really meant to honor Augustus Caesar, Caesar Augustus, because it was built during his time. Here is a diagram. This is taken from National Geographic. National Geographic Foundation sponsored many of the excavations there. And they'd had a very nice write-up about it and a book later, but it was in the magazine. Here you see the frames that they hauled out. You can see the grid of the frames, and then that would be filled with the concrete and then dropped. So here you can see boats towing it out. You see guys in the water helping to put it in place. Okay? So, there we go. Now here are Roman trade routes, of which you can see that Caesarea becomes critical, and this eastern part of the Mediterranean becomes really the main harbor in the Roman period at that time. And it links then Palestine, as well as other parts of what we might call the Middle East, with the rest of the Roman world, Roman Empire. Rome, Turkey, of course, Egypt. Egypt was the breadbasket of the ancient world. Here are some of the coins of Caesarea that were found at Caesarea, showing the commerce and the diversity. Here's some of the pottery. They've set it out there on the beach to, I don't think this is in situ. I don't think this is exactly where they found it. I think they put it out here for what I call artistic purposes. But it gives you an idea of the kind of jar. Here's a bag jar, they're called. These are made kind of storage things. This is the way things would be shipped. Things like oil, wine, sometimes even grain would be shipped in this. And then this is an amphora. Do you see these handles like this? This is an amphora that was definitely used for liquids, mostly wine. So they would export wine, like a place like Greece would export wine. Actually, later, from some of the study I've done, people were buying the wine, but it wasn't that the wine was so good, but they really liked the container it came in, and they wanted to reuse it. So, kind of like you guys with your Walmart bags. Okay, here's a head that was found, Roman period. Here's some of the lamps that were found. You can see how ornate some of them can get. These are from different periods. The upper left one is an Islamic lamp. The three center ones are definitely Roman, mold-made. Now here's something you may not think about. The Romans had keys. Here's what Roman keys look like. They would use to lock buildings, lock their house. Don't look all that different from keys we might have. Of course, today we just press a button on our phone and it sends an alarm, and people come and let us in our house. No, something like that. Now, as the divers go to look at things, here you see underwater concrete used as a base of the harbor. So you get an idea of how these guys do their work. They're actually diving and going down looking for this, but this is what some of that concrete looks like today. Of course, covered with various marine animals and plants. But here you see, I told you they used a suction hose. There's a suction hose. And then usually their hands, they kind of brush the sand, the debris into the hose. That goes up to the top. It goes through a series of screens or sift. They don't really have to sift it because it's wet. And then they can find whatever's there. And you see they're revealing what, I'm not sure if that's a bracelet or some kind of metal ring that was used for some other purpose. They also, for example, they found a first century Roman boat, Roman era boat. Of course, that presents its own problems of how do you excavate it, how do you describe it, how do you draw it, and do you try to lift it out or do you leave it? These are questions that come. Inside the boat, they did actually lift out part of this boat. Here you can see graffiti written in Greek that maybe is a way of guys keeping records. Okay, we did this one, this one, this one. There's like numbers are counting off. How many things did we unload here? So the guy didn't have any paper or anything. He just scratched it into the side of the boat. I can't imagine anyone here doing that sort of thing. And you might wonder, well, what about, if we're talking about boats, what about anchors? These are the way the anchors looked in Roman period. The anchors are, typically you see a hole and then a kind of groove. The groove is actually caused by the wear of the rope. The hole is there to insert the rope through it. And then two holes down below, because they've inserted these to be an example. But the holes down below is where they insert wood. So it's kind of like a grappling hook sort of thing to hold it in place. So this is just a little display at Caesarea, one of the museums, or one of the areas there, that shows you some of the ways ancient anchors looked and how they would be used. So when you read about it, you may think of an anchor like you see up here, the metal kind. They weren't really using that in Roman periods. That's later. They're using stone and wood. Okay, any questions about that? That's a brief overview of Caesarea Maritima. The next one, we're about out of time. The next one we'll talk about is Herodion, which is near Bethlehem. But we don't really have time, I suppose, to start that today. So we'll leave that for later. Remember, we have presentations coming up. Any questions? Yes.